It was the sort of July afternoon that seemed conjured directly from the pages of a countryside brochure. Honeyed sunlight falling gently on trimmed hedges, bees bumbling among lavender borders, and a string quartet playing Haydn beneath a billowing marquee. The vicarage garden party in St. Aldhelms-on-the-Glen was a cherished tradition. As dependable and beloved as the annual church raffle or the Women's Institute jam stall at the summer fete. Miss Marple, comfortably seated in a wicker chair near the rose arch, was knitting something delicate in pale blue wool and keeping an eye, quite unobtrusively, on the assembled company. A garden party was, in her mind, the best place in the world to observe human behavior. People forgot themselves amid cake and cordial, often revealing far more than they intended. "There's that stranger again," murmured Mrs. Lavinia Hartnell, settling beside Miss Marple with a glass of elderflower lemonade. "Fourth time I've seen him in the village this week. Always walking about with that suitcase. Hey, and not a real suitcase. Mind you, looks empty as a drum. Doesn't swing properly when he carries it." Miss Marple glanced discreetly toward the man in question. He was standing near the topiary peacock, apart from the groups of chatting villagers, dressed in an old-fashioned brown suit that seemed too warm for the weather and far too formal for the occasion. His suitcase, indeed, suspiciously lightweight, hung from one hand like a forgotten prop. He was not young, perhaps in his early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and a face not easily described, neither plain nor handsome, but with something about it that unsettled the eye, the way an amateur portrait captures the likeness but not the soul. "He came in on the Wednesday train," continued Mrs. Hartnell, fanning herself with the parish newsletter. "No one's quite sure where he's staying. Claims to be from Ipswich, but that accent is not East Anglian. And I heard from Doris, the cleaner at the post office, that he asked the grocer for matches and didn't say thank you." Miss Marple gave a polite murmur. "That is suspicious." "You joke, but I don't trust men with empty luggage," said Mrs. Hartnell firmly. "He reminds me of my second cousin's husband. Said he was in insurance and had a battered briefcase full of nothing but dog-eared racing slips. Ran off with a barmaid from Tunbridge Wells. Left the cousin with 3 guinea pigs and a mortgage." The quartet shifted to a lively minuet as Rev Pinder clinked his spoon against a teacup, signaling his desire for attention. He stood beneath the trellis, beaming, his wife beside him in her prize-winning hat. "Friends," he announced, "a warm thank you to all who have come to support our little parish this afternoon. Before the scones are entirely gone, I have the pleasure of welcoming a new visitor to St. Aldhelms, Mr. Arnold Lacey, who has kindly made a donation to our roof fund and joined us today." All heads turned to the man with the suitcase. He gave a brief nod, the corners of his mouth twitching into something approximating a smile. The villagers clapped politely, though more than one pair of eyes flicked toward the suitcase with undisguised curiosity. See, wants to be noticed. Now, hissed Mrs. Hartnell. Don't like it. Perhaps, said Miss Marple softly, he simply wished to be included. But it wasn't inclusion Mr. Arnold Lacey seemed to desire. Over the next hour, he moved awkwardly among the guests, attempting conversation with little success. He asked Major Withers too many questions about the old airfield outside the village. He inquired whether the church crypt was ever open to the public. He startled Miss Temple, the retired schoolmistress, by recognizing her surname and asking if she had once taught in Surrey. Miss Marple, ever discreet, noted the reactions of those around him. Curiosity, yes, but also discomfort. There was something ever so slightly off about Mr. Lacey, like a picture just slightly askew on a wall no one wanted to touch. Later that evening, as the garden emptied and the last cucumber sandwiches were packed away, the peace of the village shattered. It began with the scream, a ragged, wordless cry that broke across the still evening air like a dropped plate. It came from the footpath that ran behind the churchyard, just beyond the vicarage hedge. Miss Marple, already standing, was halfway across the lawn by the time others had frozen in place. She moved quickly for a woman of her age, skimming past, startled guests and following the sound. There, just beyond the lilac bush near the stone bench, stood young Beatrice Pinder, the vicar's daughter. Her face was white as chalk, and she pointed a trembling hand toward the ground. The man with the suitcase, Mr. Arnold Lacey, lay sprawled across the path, his hat several feet away, one shoe twisted at an unnatural angle. His suitcase sat open beside him. It was empty. The body, however, was not untouched. His temple bore the unmistakable mark of a heavy blow, a blunt, violent strike that had ended him instantly. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived from the county station an hour later, the vicarage garden had transformed. Policemen moved about solemnly, cordoning the path and questioning witnesses. The remains of bunting fluttered limply in the cooling air. Miss Marple sat once more in her wicker chair, her knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes fixed not on the chaos, but on the lilac bush and the deep groove in the earth beside it, where something had been dragged. It was one of those gently luminous afternoons in early July when the village of St. Aldhelms-on-the-Glen seemed to exist in a state of timeless peace. Wisps of cotton cloud drifted across a baby blue sky, and the golden sunlight filtered through the mulberry trees like honey over old lace. The vicarage garden, already known for its manicured beds and sturdy Victorian hedges, had been transformed for the annual summer fete. Trestle tables were draped with white linens. Bunting fluttered between rose arches, and the string quartet played genteel arrangements beneath the shade of a striped awning. Miss Marple was seated, as she often was at such events, in a wicker chair strategically placed near the rose border and not far from the teapot. She was knitting something pale blue and lacy, likely intended for yet another infant in her far-flung family, and she appeared to be only half listening to the conversation drifting around her. In reality, her mind was fully engaged. A garden party she had once observed to Colonel Melchett is where people show you not only who they are, but also who they want others to think they are. It's a most instructive setting. At this particular moment, the instructive setting included a number of familiar local figures. Reverend Pinder, bustling about with warm smiles and spilled lemonade. His wife, Monica, managing the jam stall with near military precision. And the formidable Mrs. Lavinia Hartnell, who had just settled beside Miss Marple and was already mid-gossip. "There's that stranger again," Lavinia muttered, leaning in with a conspiratorial air and pointing discreetly with her fan. "Standing over there by the peacock topiary. Him with the suitcase." Miss Marple's eyes followed the motion. There he was, a man in a brown suit that seemed both dusty and old-fashioned, possibly wool, quite unsuitable for the afternoon heat. He stood rigidly, not speaking to anyone, watching the guests as if he were both present and curiously separate from the event. The suitcase he carried hung from his right hand at a slight angle, as though it lacked any weight at all. "Fourth time this week I've seen him," Lavinia went on. "Always alone. Wandering about. Doesn't eat at the inn. Doesn't shop properly at the grocer's. Came into the post office and asked if we had foreign stamps." "Foreign? Perhaps he's a stamp collector," Miss Marple suggested lightly. Lavinia snorted. "A collector would carry an album, not an empty suitcase. It swings wrong, I noticed. A proper case has a sort of rhythm when it's full arm. Weight, counterbalance. His is all floaty, like he's carrying cardboard." Ms. Marple smiled quietly. Lavinia's observations, though cloaked in melodrama, often held grains of truth. The man's face was unmemorable in that unsettling way that some faces are not unattractive. Not marked by any distinguishing scars or blemishes, and yet it refused to settle in the mind. His features were just a little too even, his eyes just a shade too distant. She'd known criminals who looked jolly as plum pudding and saints who wore faces like Taxman. This man, she thought, would be easy to forget at a glance and dangerously hard to read on closer inspection. At that moment, the Reverend clinked a spoon against his teacup, a genteel ding-ding-ding, and called for attention. "My friends," he said, beaming, "thank you for making this year's fete a wonderful success already. Before we all dive back into the lemon syllabub, I'd like to extend a special welcome to a visitor among us, Mr. Arnold Lacey, who has kindly made a donation to our roof restoration fund and is joining us today for the first time." small ripple of applause spread through the garden. Heads turned. All eyes went to the man with the suitcase. He raised his hand in a small, restrained wave, but did not smile. The applause faded quickly. "How generous," murmured Miss Temple, the retired schoolmistress, "though I don't like his shoes. Dreadfully scuffed." Miss Marple, meanwhile, studied the way Mr. Lacey's gaze moved over the crowd. It wasn't a social gaze. It was an inventory, weighing, measuring, marking. He was looking for someone or something. The next half hour, he attempted conversation with several guests, though none lasted more than a minute or two. He asked Major Withers about RAF activities during the war and whether the old airfield outside the village still saw traffic. He startled Miss Temple by asking if she had taught in Surrey in 1932. He inquired, rather too casually, if the church's crypt was ever open to visitors. Miss Marple's ears pricked up at that. Most strangers asked about the stained glass windows or the medieval font. The crypt rarely drew attention. Then came the moment. It was just after 6. The sun had lowered slightly, casting longer shadows across the garden. Miss Marple was retying her yarn skein when a sharp, tearing scream cut through the soft evening like a cleaver. It came from the back of the garden beyond the vicarage, past the trellised arbor that led toward the churchyard path. It was followed by a thud and the crash of disturbed undergrowth. Guests froze. Several turned instinctively toward Miss Marple, who was already rising. She moved faster than expected, her steps quick and purposeful. Others followed in a confused Macy's Hartnell calling, "Beatrice," and the Reverend clapping his hands for order. Miss Marple reached the source of the cry just moments before the others. There on the crushed moss near the lilac bush lay the man with the suitcase. Mr. Arnold Lacey was sprawled in an unnatural posture. One hand twisted beneath him, the other still stretched out as if reaching. His hat had landed yards away. His suitcase open beside him contained nothing but a thin film of dust and a scrap of torn fabric. It was indeed empty. Beatrice Pinder, the vicar's 20-year-old daughter, stood stock still a few paces away, her face ghost pale, her breath short and panicked. "I didn't touch him. My just came to cut through to the shed-eye. Saw he was all ready." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder and turned her gaze to the body. Mr. Lacey's temple bore a darkening bruise, misshapen and harsh. Blow heavy and fast, fatal. The suitcase had fallen open on the path. But the mark on the side of Lacey's head suggested the weapon had been something else. Something round, solid, perhaps. She looked down at the border near the lilac bush. There, half hidden by trampled grass, was a shallow groove in the soil, a faint drag mark. Someone had taken something. In the garden, the string quartet had long ceased playing. Murmurs and footsteps approached as the village's peace dissolved. Miss Marple straightened slowly. Her eyes were calm, reflective. Another death, another story behind it. And if her instincts were correct, as they almost always were, this wasn't a stranger's accident. This was something planted deep in St. Aldhelm's soil, something familiar, something meant to stay hidden. But it hadn't. The morning after the vicarage garden party, St. Aldhelm's on the Glen buzzed like a disturbed beehive. News of Mr. Arnold Lacey's sudden and violent death had spread with astonishing speed, faster than lightning, as Mrs. Hartnell pointed out, because at least lightning could be localized. But this was everywhere. By 9 o'clock, the bell above the post office door had rung nearly 24 times. Customers came ostensibly for stamps, wire, paper, or bread, coupons, but lingered with eager, darting eyes and half-formed speculations. By 10, someone had already drafted a full account of the murder for the parish newsletter, though it was wisely intercepted by Miss Temple before it reached the mimeograph. He was a spy, declared Mr. Lorimer, the stationer, over the biscuit display at Townsend's grocer's. Heard from the boy who helps at the station. Carried foreign coins and a list of names in cipher. Cyril said so. Don't be daft, replied Mrs. Moody, the butcher's wife, as she measured out half a pound of streaky bacon. He was a blackmailer. Heard he asked Beatrice Pinder if her mother had ever been in a sanatorium. Blackmailers always ask personal things. It was neither the first nor the last theory offered that day. Some said he was a disgraced solicitor. There's a vagrant who dressed well to fool the police. One version even had him as an escaped lunatic with a taste for Crips. None mentioned the empty suitcase, yet that detail above all had rooted itself firmly in Miss Marple's mind. She had said little that morning, sipping her tea quietly in her neat sitting room as the church bell tolled 11. Her lace curtains fluttered in the breeze, and from her window she could just glimpse the top of the vicarage spire. A gentle knock sounded on her door. It was Inspector Craddock. He removed his hat respectfully. Miss Marple, hoped I might speak with you, of course, Inspector. Come in. You'll take a cup of tea. He accepted with a grateful nod and settled into the armchair across from her. Miss Marple poured the tea with quiet efficiency, her manner calm, unhurried. We've confirmed the blow was delivered by a blunt object, Craddock said. Something rounded, not sharp. No fingerprints. We're canvassing the area for anything missing or out of place. No weapon found. Not yet. Though we did find a faint impression in the soil near the lilac bush. Something was dragged away. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Curious. One wonders whether it was the weapon or something else entirely. Craddock narrowed his eyes. You noticed the mark, too? I did, she replied simply. And I noticed Mr. Lacey's suitcase was empty. Craddock nodded. We examined the suitcase. Worn on the outside, but nothing inside but a bit of cloth, lint, and a reddish thread. No labels or papers. Very clean. He arrived on Wednesday's train, Miss Marple said quietly. And he's stayed nowhere in the village. No bookings at the inn. No guest house record. And yet, no one remembers him carrying luggage off the train. Just that suitcase.
Exactly,
Craddock said, and now he's dead. In a garden full of witnesses, no one saw or heard the blow. Beatrice Pinder insists she found him like that. Beatrice is a truthful girl, Miss Marple murmured, though I dare say not observant. She notices appearances, not absences. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Absences. Miss Marple only smiled gently and sipped her tea. By midday, the village's tone had shifted from shock to suspicion. A police constable stood outside the churchyard, directing curious strollers away from the crime scene. But that didn't stop the murmuring. In the tea rooms and parlors, attention turned not only to the dead man, but to one another. He knew too much, said Mr. Tuffley, the retired solicitor. Asked odd questions about the church crypt, about families. Perhaps he was writing a book, suggested Miss Temple, ever rational. Something historical. But others were not convinced. Beatrice Pinder, still pale and shaken, gave her account a second time to Craddock under the watchful eye of her mother. I'd gone round the back way to fetch secateurs from the shed, she said, and there he was, lying on his side. The suitcase was already open. I didn't see anyone else. Truly. And you heard nothing before that? No. I'd just stepped away from the garden after speaking to Daphne Withers about her rhubarb tart. Then I walked toward the lilac bush and then I screamed. Her mother, Monica Pinder, pressed a handkerchief to her nose. Oh, she wouldn't lie, Inspector. Not my Beatrice. Miss Marple watched the exchange silently from a wicker chair on the vicarage lawn, where a few chairs still stood from the previous day's fete. The bunting had been taken down, and the quartet had packed away. But the faint memory of music still hung in the air like the echo of something unfinished. She reflected on Mr. Arnold Lacey's arrival. He had not blended. Not truly. He had mimicked politeness, but asked peculiar questions. He had carried a suitcase as though it were a signal, not a necessity. Then there was the matter of his donation to the church. She made a note to ask Monica Pinder about that. The Reverend himself approached, wringing his hands. Miss Marple, I can't make sense of it. Poor man, such a generous gesture. And now this. You said he donated to the roof fund. Yes, £20 in cash. Just walked into the study and handed it over the day before yesterday. No name attached. Well, he said it was for the good of the place. I assumed he was an antiquarian. He asked about the crypt, the vestry, even the ancient chalice in the display case. And you showed him. I showed him the display items. Yes, the crypt is always locked. Who else has keys to it? Just myself and the sexton, Mr. Beale. Though I dare say the bishop keeps one somewhere. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. That evening, as shadows lengthened over St. Aldhelm's rooftops, the village grew quiet again. The heat had broken, and a breeze stirred the hedgerows, but the unease lingered. Stores shut earlier than usual. Curtains were drawn before sunset. It was not fear so much as disquiet, a sense that someone among them knew more than they had said. Miss Marple sat on her veranda, listening to the soft clink of teacups and the rustle of leaves. What sort of man comes to a village with an empty suitcase, asks questions about locked places, donates anonymously, and ends up murdered? More pressingly, what had the killer taken with them when they fled? The answer, she was certain, lay not in what Mr. Lacey had brought, but in what he had uncovered. And someone in St. Aldhelm's on the Glen would do anything to ensure that secret stayed buried. By the following morning, Inspector Craddock had stationed 2 constables outside the churchyard, and an officer was posted at the village hall, where preliminary statements were being collected. He had also arranged to speak privately with Miss Marple, though, as he privately admitted to himself, private was a relative term in a place like St. Aldhelm's on the Glen. Craddock regarded Miss Marple with the kind of respectful tolerance a seasoned detective might afford a clever, meddlesome, and occasionally vexing, yet undeniably precise. She had a knack for spotting motive where others saw only confusion. Once more they sat in Miss Marple's cozy front room. Sunlight slanting over embroidered cushions and shelves lined with gardening pamphlets, hymnals, and well-thumbed volumes of Punch. I spoke with the local station, Craddock began. Arnold Lacey isn't entirely unknown. His name came up years ago in a probate dispute in Ipswich. He claimed to be a distant heir to a defunct estate, but it never held up. No charges, but there was talk, fortune hunting. Miss Marple prompted, of the speculative sort. He's also had dealings with at least one London antiquities dealer, mostly fakes. Artifacts that never quite added up. Interesting, she murmured. He asked Reverend Pinder about the crypt. Craddock nodded. And the vestry. And the silver chalice in the display case. Seems he had his eye on something specific. In the church, his donation to the roof fund might have been a cover-an investment, but he was murdered before he could retrieve whatever it was, Miss Marple said softly. Leaning forward, Craddock asked, "Do you think he found something before he died?" "I do," she replied. And I suspect someone else knew it too. We've interviewed most of the garden party guests, Craddock said. Nothing useful so far. No one saw or heard a thing. People often see more than they realize, Miss Marple observed, but they interpret what they see through their own expectations, especially in places like this. She glanced out the window, watching Mrs. Finch walking her dog across the green. Here, observations are filtered by class, routine, and prejudice. A stranger in a worn suit asking questions. Naturally, they assume he's a spy or criminal. But few have wondered why he came here at all. Craddock nodded slowly. You think he came for something that once belonged here? Or to someone, she replied. Family secrets run deep in old villages. People bury more than bones in parish grounds. Her words lingered with him as he left. Afternoon, Craddock returned to Reverend Pinder, who led him down to the church vestry where the silver chalice stood in a locked glass case. It's been here for over a century, the vicar explained. A donation from Lady Caradinatine 47, supposedly connected to the monastery that once stood here. Quite valuable, though never appraised. Craddock examined the lock and touched. No scratches or signs of forced entry. And the crypt. The vicar hesitated, rarely opened. It was the family vault for the St. Aldhelm rectors. The last interment was in 1892, damp, echoey, and unpleasant. May I see it? Pinder fetched a key from the sacristy and led Craddock through the south transept and down a narrow spiral staircase. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the smell of lichen and stillness. Iron candle sconces lined the walls, untouched for decades. This is it, the Reverend said reverently. 12 sealed niches. Some rubble along the western wall from an 1880s collapse. Nothing disturbed recently. Crouching near the rubble, Craddock noticed a faint reddish smudge on the floor too fresh to be dust. Not blood, perhaps clay or rust. He traced it with a gloved finger. Has anyone been down here since the party? No, the vicar answered firmly. Craddock said nothing but made a mental note to return. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Lavinia Hartnell, who, unsurprisingly, had amassed a wealth of gossip. He wasn't English-born, Lavinia declared, pouring tea with an anxious energy. He said schedule instead of schedule. That's American or Canadian, perhaps. And he asked poor Daphne Withers about the Withers name, whether it was Cornish or Saxon. Who asks that at a garden party? Miss Marple accepted a biscuit and waited. Also, Lavinia continued, he was fascinated by family graves, not just the crypt. Mr. Tuffley told me he asked if there were any unmarked graves in the village. Said he had an ancestor buried here in secret. Sounds like a story from a novel. Really? Did he ask about any specific families? The Pinders, I think. Possibly the Brents. And he asked after old Isaac Bell, the former sexton. Long dead. Why anyone would care about Isaac Beale, I don't know. Miss Marple smiled quietly. Thank you, Lavinia. More helpful than you realize. On her way home, she passed the old Beale cottage long empty, its windows shuttered, and chimney leaning precariously. The Brents, too, were a name not easily forgotten. Once prosperous landowners, they'd lost much during the war. Only Arthur Brent remained, a recluse nursing a bad hip and a taste for rare brandy. She planned to visit him next. That evening, as twilight painted the village rooftops in soft lavender, Miss Marple sat by her window, gazing out with renewed curiosity. Arnold Lacey hadn't come just to steal. That was too simple. He had been searching, perhaps confirming something. The empty suitcase. His questions about graves and the cryptid all pointed to a connection to St. Aldhelm's beyond mere curiosity or greed. No one risks so much to uncover a secret unless they belong to it, or are owed something. And now, he was dead. The question remained, who had the most to lose if Lacey succeeded? St. Aldhelm's and Glen had never been more tightly knit-tanned, yet more frayed at the edges than it was now. In the wake of Arnold Lacey's murder, beneath polite tea-drinking and manicured gardens ran a current of suspicion and whispered speculation. Spectre Craddock focused on the obvious suspects, those closest to Lacey at the garden party, and those with histories suggesting motive. Miss Marple, as always, remained a quiet observer, listening and watching for the truths hidden in words and gestures. The first to be re-interviewed was Beatrice Pinder. The vicar's daughter was still pale but steadier than the morning after. Her story was consistent. She found Lacey lying by the lilac bush, suitcase open and empty, and screamed for help. Yet Craddock sensed a hidden edge in her account. She's young, scared, but seems sincere, he told Miss Marple during a brief meeting. No one else can confirm she was near the crypt path just before the murder. If someone had, she'd be cleared. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Youth often sees what it wishes or is too frightened to see what it does not. Later, Miss Marple spoke with Monica Pinder, Beatrice's mother, who wore a composed yet strained expression. Beatrice was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, Monica insisted gently. She was cutting flowers for the altar. Nothing more. No reason to suspect her. Miss Marple inclined her head politely, but said nothing. She'd learned. Villagers protect their own fiercely when fear takes hold. Another person of interest was Major Edward Withers, a retired army man known for his quick temper and strong opinions. He'd attended the garden party with his wife, Daphne, and spoken at length with Lacey about the war and the nearby old airfield. Miss Marple noted the sharp intensity in his gaze during their brief encounter. The Major was an imposing figure still. Sharp at 70, with closely cropped gray hair and an erect posture. When Craddock questioned him, Major Withers was brisk and evasive. "I hardly know the man," he said. "He asked odd questions, but I had no quarrel with him." "You seemed uneasy around him," Craddock pressed. The Major's jaw tightened. "Nonsense. I suspect no one here. We are a peaceful community." Miss Marple thought otherwise. She recalled how Withers had been among the few who offered to help arrange church security after the murder, as if eager to exert control. Finally, there was Arthur Brent, the last surviving Brent, a man of few words and many grudges. He lived alone in the sprawling manor on the village's edge, rarely seen in public. Miss Marple had visited him the morning after the murder, drawn by gossip that Lacey had asked about the Brents. Arthur received her with a wary stare and reluctant nod. "Ah, why ask about my family?" he growled when Lacey's inquiries were mentioned. "Curiosity," Miss Marple replied. He seemed interested in family graves and village history. Arthur's eyes darkened. "History is dangerous. Best left undisturbed. Did you know Mr. Lacey?" In passing, he sniffed around. "A few days ago, asking about old papers? A will or deed," he said, "and I told him to mind his own business. What's done is done. Done." His tone implied more than just a simple warning. Miss Marple's next visit was to the formidable Mrs. Lavinia Hartnell, who eagerly shared the details she had gathered about Mr. Lacey. Over a pot of fragrant Darjeeling tea, Lavinia offered an unsolicited theory. "He's not who he claims to be," she asserted. "The American accent, the empty suitcase, it's all a facade. Probably some kind of conman, or worse. We've had a few like that around here before, always preying on people's kindness." Miss Marple probed gently. "Did he mention any names or places he might be connected to?" "No," Lavinia replied. "Only that he might have an ancestor buried here. But that's common knowledge. Many families have deep roots in St. Aldhelm's." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "True enough. But some ancestors hide more than others." As the investigation deepened, a curious pattern emerged. Most of Arnold Lacey's questions focused on the village's history, its family trees, and most intriguingly, the church crypt and unmarked graves. One early evening, Miss Marple found herself wandering past the vicarage again. The faint scent of freshly turned earth lingered in the air. She paused by the lilac bush, her fingers brushing the grass's edge. The groove in the soil where something had clearly been dragged at her thoughts. She recalled the empty suitcase. Why carry it if not to conceal something? Was it merely a distraction? She also remembered that at the garden party, Arnold Lacey had asked about the Pinder family, the Brents, and old Isaac Bell, the long-deceased sexton whose cottage had stood empty for years. Isaac Beale had been known as a quiet man, a keeper of secrets, deeply tied to the church and village records. Miss Marple's next step was clear the Beale cottage. The small weathered cottage stood on the edge of the village green, windows shuttered, garden wild with nettles and ivy. Miss Marple pushed open the rusty gate, which protested with a creak, and crossed the porch. Inside, the air was cool and musty. She found a small desk cluttered with yellowed ledgers and scraps of paper, many covered in neat, spidery handwriting. Somewhere in this clutter lay the key to Arnold Lacey's visitant, perhaps the reason for his murder. Her fingers traced a faded ledger, stopping on a page listing burials and family plots from decades past. One name stood out: Beatrice Brent, buried in 1923, marked. Glanced at the calendar pinned above the desk, yellowed with age. That same year, a curious entry noted a disputed will involving the Brent estate. A shiver ran through her. Family secrets, indeed. Stepping out of the cottage into the fading light, Miss Marple heard footsteps behind her. Miss Marple. It was Inspector Craddock, arriving with a small parcel. "I found this in the church safe," he said, handing it over. Inside was an old leather-bound diary, worn but intact.
Oh.
The handwriting was unfamiliar, cramped, and hurried. It belonged to Isaac Beale, Craddock explained. "The sexton. Thought you might want to look at it." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Thank you, Inspector. This could be very revealing." As twilight deepened, the two stood watching the village settle into uneasy silence. Many suspects and secrets loomed, but only one truth. In her sitting room, Miss Marple examined the diary. The soft afternoon light illuminated the cramped handwriting, each line a whisper from the past. The diary's early pages were mostly mundane: notes on church repairs, graveyard maintenance, and funeral details. But deeper entries grew personal, revealing Isaac's sharp observations on village affairs and hints of tension beneath St. Aldhelm's calm surface. One entry caught her eye. May 12, 1923. The dispute over the Brent estate unsettles the village. Beatrice Brent's burial was rushed and secretive. No stone marks her grave by her mother's wish. Strange that a family so proud of legacy would allow such erasure. Miss Marple leaned back, tapping her fingers thoughtfully. The unmarked grave of Beatrice Brent, mentioned by Mrs. Hartnell, now connected to a long-ago family scandal. Could the secret be buried there? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. It was Lucy, her faithful neighbor and occasional helper. "I thought you might like some tea," Lucy said, entering with a steaming pot and a plate of scones. "Thank you, Lucy." Just in time, Miss Marple smiled, closing the diary gently. "You remember the Brents, don't you?" she asked. Lucy nodded. "Course. Everyone in the village remembers the Brents. A tragic family, really. Arthur Brent is the last of the line." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And what of Beatrice Brent from the diary? Lucy frowned thoughtfully. Aunt Beatrice. Yes. She was a distant cousin who disappeared under sad circumstances. Some say the family wanted to forget her. No one talks about her much. Miss Marple's interest deepened. The unmarked grave and the family's desire to erase her presence hinted at a secret worth hiding. Later, Miss Marple arranged to visit Arthur Brent. His house was a dim, brooding presence on the village's edge, surrounded by tangled gardens that spoke of neglect and faded grandeur. Arthur answered the door with a wary glance. Ah, you again, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not troubling you. Mr. Brent, I wanted to ask about Beatrice Brent and the diary of Isaac Beale, which I recently came across. Arthur's jaw tightened. What about Beatrice? She was buried in an unmarked grave, according to the sexton's diary. There was a dispute over the estate at the time. I wondered if you might shed some light on that. Arthur's face darkened. For a moment, he seemed about to close the door, then stepped aside. Come in, he said gruffly. Inside, the manor smelled of old wood and forgotten memories. Arthur led Miss Marple to a small study filled with dusty books and photographs of stern-faced ancestors. The Brents had secrets, he began, settling into a leather armchair. Beatrice was difficult. She challenged the family, threatened to expose things best left alone. She vanished shortly after the dispute. Vanished. Miss Marple asked carefully. Arthur nodded slowly. Not quite vanished. She was buried hastily, but rumors say she might have left the village. Miss Marple listened carefully, piecing together fragments. Mr. Lacey asked about family graves and unmarked plots. You think he was connected to the Brents? Arthur shook his head. I don't know. But if he was looking for Beatrice's story, he was meddling in matters that could reopen old wounds. As Miss Marple left the manor, she pondered the link between Lacey, the Brents, and the village's hidden past. The empty suitcase, the anonymous donation, the interest in crypts and graves, they all pointed toward a secret buried deeper than a simple family scandal. That evening, back in her sitting room, Miss Marple examined the diary again. A small folded note slipped from between the pages. She unfolded it carefully. It was a faded photograph of a young woman's delicate features. Dark hair, eyes hauntingly familiar. On the back was a single word, remember. Miss Marple's breath caught. The photo was of Beatrice Brent. She sensed Arnold Lacey's visit and his murder were tied not just to curiosity, but to a legacy someone wanted to keep buried at any cost. The question remained, what had Lacey uncovered, and who among the villagers feared that truth enough to kill? Depending on who you ask, was never fully explained. Miss Marple felt a ripple of recognition. The village's veneer of respectability masked old wounds and tangled relationships. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Major Withers. He was pruning his roses with deliberate care when she arrived, the scent of crushed petals heavy in the air. "Major Withers," she began, "I hope you don't mind my intrusion." The major straightened, wiping his hands. "Not at all. Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" She settled beside the garden bench. "I wanted to ask about Beatrice Brent. There are rumors linking you two, some decades past." The major's eyes narrowed. "I don't entertain village gossip, of course." But Arnold Lacey asked about family secrets. Perhaps he knew. More than we thought. Major Withers's jaw tightened. Lacey was trouble. A meddler. "Did you know him before the garden party?" "Only in passing." His voice grew colder. "And I've no wish to dwell on the past." Miss Marple studied his expression, the flicker of regret beneath the surface, swiftly concealed. "Beatrice was important to you once, wasn't she?" The major looked away, momentarily vulnerable. "We were young, foolish, things happened that should never have." She waited patiently. "It ended badly," he admitted at last. She was unstable, threatened to ruin reputations. I didn't want her to harm the family. Did you see her recently?" "Before her death? No, but I knew she had enemies." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Enemies who might not want secrets uncovered." That evening the village inn was unusually full. News traveled fast, and the murder had stirred old allegiances and resentments. Miss Marple found herself seated near Arthur Brent, who nursed a glass of brandy in silence. She ventured gently, "Mr. Brent, what can you tell me about the families? Secrets. I know you spoke of things better left undisturbed." Arthur grunted. "Secrets are the currency of the past. They protect us, or bind us. Beatrice's death was a loss more than that, a wound. But some wounds never heal because the cause remains." "Did Arnold Lacey threaten to open old wounds?" Miss Marple asked. Arthur's gaze darkened. "He asked too many questions. Questions I wished I could answer but dared not." Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to the empty suitcase and the mysterious donation to the church. Someone was desperate to hide the truth, and someone else was desperate to reveal it. The following morning, Miss Marple arranged to meet Beatrice Pinder privately. The young woman's face was still pale, but her eyes held a quiet resolve. "I wanted to ask you about Mr. Lacey," Miss Marple began gently. "He seemed interested in the village's past and certain families. Did you notice anything unusual in his behavior?" Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "He asked about the Brents, the Pinders, even about Isaac Beale, but he was always careful, never said much." "Did he say why?" "No, but I think He was looking for something hidden. Miss Marple reached out and squeezed her hand. Sometimes the past casts long shadows, Beatrice. And sometimes it's safer to keep those shadows covered. Beatrice looked down. I don't want to believe someone killed him to protect a secret, but now I don't know what to think. Thus Marple returned to the churchyard, lingering near the lilac bush where Arnold Lacey had been found. The faint groove in the soil where something had been dragged troubled her still. Her eyes caught a glint beneath a cluster of leaves. Kneeling, she uncovered a small rusted key attached to a worn leather fob. She held it delicately between finger and thumb. Now what might this open? She murmured. Later, at the vicarage, she showed the key to Reverend Pinder. The vicar examined it carefully. It's old, very old. Could belong to any number of locks around the church. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Perhaps the crypt. Reverend Pinder hesitated. I don't know. The crypt has been sealed for decades. Only I and the sexton have keys. Isaac Beale's cottage. Any chance the key might fit there? No, the vicar said firmly. That door is padlocked with a newer lock. Miss Marple's mind turned over possibilities. The key, the diary, the photograph, they formed a thread linking past and present, a thread someone wanted to sever forever. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in muted purples, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room and laid out the puzzle before her. Who held the key to the village's darkest secrets? Who stood to lose everything if the past were revealed? And most urgent of all, what had been dragged from the scene of Arnold Lacey's murder? The answers, she knew, were close at hand. Rain fell in steady sheets the next morning, casting St. Hedwig's into a somber hue. The village had turned inward again. Curtains remained drawn longer than usual. Boots sat drying by hearths. And conversation, normally abundant in shops and over hedges, was now confined to murmurs indoors. The murder had not receded into local lore just yet. In fact, it had deepened its hold. Miss Marple, bundled in her pale blue mac and armed with a folded umbrella, paid another visit to Inspector Craddock at the temporary station set up in the old post office. Miss Marple Craddock greeted her, half amused, half wary. Only imagine what new twist you've unearthed, Spectre, she replied with her usual serenity. I came to see whether you've examined Mr. Lacey's suitcase again. Craddock's brow furrowed. It was quite empty, as you saw. Not even a spare shirt. Quite so. But have you had the lining checked? That paused him. No? Should we? I would, if only because I've known certain discreet gentlemen to hide items between the fabric seams. There was once a gentleman from Tunbridge Wells who kept his letters from 3 different fiancées sewn into his umbrella. Quite awkward when it rained. Craddock sighed, then signaled for a constable. Have forensics go over the suitcase. Again, carefully, especially the lining. Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. I do have one other item of interest, she said, opening her reticule and producing the rusted key she had discovered near the lilac bush. Would you be so kind as to look into what this opens? It doesn't match Isaac Beale's cottage or the vestry, and Reverend Pinder assures me it isn't a church key. Craddock took the key and turned it over. We'll run it down. And you? He asked. What are you investigating today? I think, she said gently, I shall visit the Pinders again. Beatrice Pinder has something weighing on her. And sometimes people only need to be asked the right way. Beatrice Pinder sat stiffly on a window bench when Miss Marple arrived. She watched the rain trace slow patterns on the glass, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Oh, you always notice things, Miss Marple, she said without preamble. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I merely ask what others might overlook. She settled into the chair opposite her. You knew Arnold Lacey, didn't you? More than you let on. Beatrice turned sharply. He was no stranger to me. I knew him years ago. Miss Marple said nothing. He came to St. Hedwig's. Once when I was 17, summer, I was helping Reverend Pinder with records. Arnold said he was researching war memorials. But he was asking strange questions even then. About family names, old graves, and you never told anyone. He left as suddenly as he came, but I remembered his eyes. The same look when he came back last week. As if he knew more about this place than we did. What did he want from you? Beatrice swallowed. He wanted to know about Isaac Beale and Beatrice Brent. He said I looked like her, but younger. Miss Marple tilted her head. And that frightened you? No, Beatrice whispered. Made me wonder about my mother. Miss Marple blinked. Your mother. I was adopted. The Pinders told me as much when I turned 18. They don't speak of it, but Arnold. He suggested that my real mother might have been someone from this village. Someone who had to give me away. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her gloves. Did he say who? Beatrice nodded. He thought it might have been Beatrice Brent, and that someone had lied about her death. Miss Marple exhaled softly. And what do you believe? I don't know. But now he's dead. And I think someone killed him because he was getting close. That evening, Craddock returned to Miss Marple's cottage, rain dripping from his hat. You were right about the suitcase, he said, pulling out a sealed envelope. The lining had been opened and resewn. We found this tucked inside letters and a single page from an old birth record. He laid them out on her side table. The letters were in the same looping hand as the note found on the photograph. A woman's writing, intimate, desperate. Many were unsigned, but one bore the name Beatrice Brent. The record was more damning. Birth certificate, partial and smudged by age, indicating the birth of a female child in 1910. Mother, Beatrice Brent. No father listed. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She turned to Craddock. So the girl was born and hidden. Craddock nodded grimly. The implication is clear. If Beatrice Brent gave birth to a child and it was kept secret, there's motive enough to silence anyone trying to bring that to light. Miss Marple tapped her fingers on the table. Which brings us back to the photograph. It wasn't just sentimental. It was evidence. Arnold Lacey wasn't just poking into village history, he was tracing a lineage. And that lineage led here. Who would be desperate enough to kill for that? Miss Marple looked up. Anyone with a stake in preserving a name or protecting a family's legacy. Someone who knows the truth, and fears what it might cost. The following day, the skies cleared, and Miss Marple attended the weekly flower show committee meeting, hosted by Lavinia Hartnell. Conversation flitted lightly between peony categories and marrow weights, but the real storm brewed beneath. Major Withers arrived late and unusually disheveled. Miss Marple noted the tightness of his jaw, the flushed face. He caught her eye and stiffened. "Miss Marple," he said after the meeting ended. "A word." She followed him onto the gravel path. "Do you believe I had anything to do with that man's death?" he asked directly. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I believe you are a man who values order and family name. I also believe you once made a mistake you've never forgiven yourself for." His mouth thinned. If Beatrice had a child, no one knew. Or if they did, they buried it deep. And perhaps that child lives in St. Hedwig's even now. He looked away. "Would you protect your family's reputation at all costs, Major?" He flinched. "It's not about reputation. It's about peace for everyone." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "peace comes only after truth." That night, Beatrice Pinder did not return home. Her bicycle was found near the lane leading to the old mill abandon. The village stirred again. Miss Marple stared out her window, eyes solemn. Another twist, she thought. But whose hand had guided it? She reached for her shawl and hat. There was one place left unsearched. The morning mist lingered low over St. Hedwig's, blurring the hedgerows and cloaking the rooftops in a pale, eerie stillness. The disappearance of Beatrice Pinder had struck. A new chord sharper, more urgent. For a village already steeped in speculation, this second disturbance was almost too much. Miss Marple did not attend church that Sunday morning. Instead, she sat quietly in her parlor with a piece of lace in her lap and thoughts far from her tatting needle. Her blue eyes, usually mild, were alert and purposeful. The pattern was coming together. She had seen its like before, not in precise facts or forensic clues, but in human hearts. Guilt, concealment, pride, and shame, they followed predictable lines, like embroidery on stiff muslin. The people of St. Hedwig's, each thinking they could hide their threads, had only tangled the design further. At 10:15, she rose and went to her bureau. From a side drawer, she retrieved a small black-bound notebook she'd been keeping since the day Arnold Lacey arrived. Her handwriting was neat, her entries brief. Names, timelines, curious remarks. A sketch of the note found with the photograph. She ran her finger down the list and circled 2 names, Major Jonathan Withers and Reverend Thomas Pinder. One had reason to protect a family's history. The other had access to the truth and perhaps reason to obscure it. She closed the notebook. It was time to set her final little test in motion. At 11 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived at St. Hedwig's Rectory. Reverend Pinder greeted her with red-rimmed eyes and visible fatigue. He was thinner than usual, his clerical collar seeming to loose about his neck. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a wan smile, "forgive me, I haven't the clearest mind this morning. I haven't seen Beatrice since yesterday. She didn't come home last night." "I am aware," she said gently. "I was hoping I might look at the parish archives. The older birth records, if you please." Pinder hesitated. "Those are quite old and fragile. Is it truly necessary?" "I believe it is," Miss Marple said with soft insistence. "I believe someone long ago attempted to obscure a child's birth, and that omission may be at the heart of our current troubles." The rector sighed and led her through the vestry door to the narrow room behind it. A small, dust-smelling chamber of worn volumes and stacked ledgers. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the bindings. "May I?" He nodded, watching her.
All right.
She pulled one volume carefully from the middle shelf. Births, Baptisms and Burials, -109292921912. Flipping through the crisped pages, she found the entry she'd half expected. August 1910. A female child. No name. Mother, Beatrice Brent. Father, blank. She looked up. "Did you know this was here?" Reverend Pinder didn't answer right away. "I came across it once, years ago, but I thought it irrelevant. Beatrice Brent passed in childbirth. There was no child to raise, so far as anyone knew. But the record remains. And someone tried very hard to pretend it didn't exist." He looked suddenly very old. "What do you want from me, Miss Marple?"
A name.
She said. Calmly, a confirmation. "You married Beatrice Brent and Isaac. Beale. In 1909. You buried her in 1910. But did you ever see the child? Reverend Pinder was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Yes." Miss Marple's breath caught. She was born in secret, sent away, almost at once.
Oh.
Isaac couldn't bear to keep her, not after Beatrice died.
Oh.
He said she'd be better off far from here.
Oh.
I arranged for her placement through a cousin in Ely, and the child. Don't know what became of her. I never followed it. Miss Marple frowned slightly.
Okay.
Then you may not know that Beatrice Pinder, your own niece's, that very child. His mouth dropped open.
Okay.
It is true, Miss Marple said. Arnold Lacey came to St. Hedwig's searching for her identity. He believed she was Beatrice Brent's daughter. The photograph, the letters, he had collected evidence, but someone must have confirmed it. Pinder looked horrified. And now she's missing. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Yes, and we must find her before someone else ensures she never speaks the truth. 2 hours later, Miss Marple took tea at Major Withers's cottage. It was a spontaneous visit, or so it seemed. The Major, still shaken, welcomed her stiffly, his usual bluntness softened by apprehension. "I don't suppose you've come to talk about chrysanthemums," he said. "No, Major. I came about Arnold Lacey and Beatrice Brent." The Major's teacup paused mid-air. "She had a child," Miss Marple continued. "You knew that, and so did Arnold." He set the cup down with a clatter. "If that child were still alive?" "She is," Miss Marple said. "And I believe you've known that for some time." The Major's face darkened. "She's Beatrice Pinder, the girl who vanished yesterday. And I think she found out, or someone told her. Perhaps Arnold himself." His jaw twitched. "You think I killed him?" "I think you've carried guilt for 30 years. But guilt does strange things, Major. It makes men desperate." He said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Do you know where Beatrice is?" The Major met her eyes, and for one raw second, the silence between them was heavy with fear, sorrow, and something close to panic. Then he said, "Check the old root cellar behind the mill. Isaac used to store preserves there. Hardly anyone remembers it." Miss Marple rose slowly. "If anything has happened to her, Major, I shall hold you personally responsible." He didn't answer, but he didn't stop her from leaving. The path to the mill was muddy and overgrown. Miss Marple, with her walking stick and steady tread, made slow but certain progress. When she reached the half-buried cellar door beneath the bramble patch, she paused. It was bolted from the outside. Someone had gone to great trouble to hide it, but not well enough. With difficulty, she pried the rusted latch free. The door creaked open. Inside, The space was damp, thick with mildew. And there, curled in the corner, pale and frightened, was Beatrice Pinder. Her eyes widened at the sight of the old lady. "You're safe now," Miss Marple said calmly. "Come, we must speak. There's much to untangle yet." By nightfall, Beatrice sat wrapped in a blanket beside Miss Marple's hearth, sipping warm milk. Craddock had arrived, summoned by urgent note. Beatrice's story was fragmented, but coherent enough. Someone had confronted her, cornered her on the path, demanded to know what Arnold had told her. When she didn't answer, they threatened her and left her locked away. "They said they'd come back," she whispered. "Said no one would believe me." "But someone always does," Miss Marple said, her voice kind but resolute. She turned to Craddock. "Now, Inspector, I believe it is time we called everyone together. The truth must come out." Craddock frowned. "At the hall." "No," Miss Marple said. "At the church, where it all began." The bells of St. Hedwig's rang out not for service, but by special request on unusual peal on a weekday afternoon. The sound rippled across the village with a solemn rhythm, summoning not the faithful but the fearful. Rumor had already flared through streets and hedgerows like a fire in dry grass. Beatrice Pinder had been found, alive, and Miss Marple had something to say. Inside the old stone church, sunlight filtered weakly through the stained glass windows. The pews had begun to fill. Major Withers sat stiffly near the back, arms crossed. Mrs. Constance Mayhew, looking pale and curious, took her place beside Dr. Shaw, who kept glancing toward the vestry. The rector, Reverend Thomas Pinder, stood near the altar rail, his expression tight with dread. Beatrice was not present. At Miss Marple's insistence, she had remained at the cottage under quiet protection. "Sue's been through quite enough," the old lady had said firmly to Inspector Craddock. Miss Marple herself now emerged from the side aisle with the inspector in tow. She walked slowly, her small frame dwarfed by the vaulted ceiling, but there was nothing frail in her manner. Her eyes swept the gathering with polite exactness. "Thank you all for coming," she said, standing before the altar. "This will not take long. But truth, I find, is best spoken plainly and in the place where lies began. There was a murmur through the pews, uncertain and expectant. Craddock stood to one side, arms folded. He had seen Miss Marple operate before gently, almost indiscernibly, and had learned to trust her timing. Miss Marple continued. "Several weeks ago, a young man named Arnold Lacey arrived in St. Hedwig's. He claimed to be seeking work. That was only partly true. In fact, he was searching for a missing name, a link in his own history and in someone else's." She paused. He believed that the woman who raised him was not his mother, that his birth had been concealed, And he had reason to suspect that a child once born here in this parish was involved. A child born out of wedlock and quietly erased. Reverend. Pinder's shoulders tensed visibly. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward him. You kept the records, Rector. You performed the burial. You also performed the wedding that preceded it. Am not accusing you of wrongdoing, but of omission. Beatrice Brent gave birth to a daughter in 1910, shortly before she died. The child survived, and that child was sent away. Someone gasped. Mrs. Mayhew placed a hand to her chest. Miss Marple nodded. That child, I believe, was placed under another name and lived her life unaware of her true origins. Until recently. Craddock took a step forward. This child, now a grown woman, is Beatrice Pinder. All eyes turned toward Reverend Pinder. He hesitated only a moment. Then, voice low and brittle, he said, "It is true." The silence in the church deepened. Even the ticking of the old brass clock behind the choir loft seemed suddenly audible. Miss Marple continued. Arnold Lacey learned part of the truth. He came to speak to Miss Pinder, I believe, or possibly the rector. Someone did not want that truth revealed. Her eyes now shifted to the back pews. That someone followed. Arnold confronted him, took from him a set of documents and a photograph. That person struck him with enough force to cause his death. A long breath was drawn across the sanctuary. Dr. Shaw, suddenly uneasy, asked, "Are you saying it was murder?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Though not premeditated, I believe. An act of desperation." But what followed was more telling. The suitcase, empty and discarded. The photograph, planted to mislead. Craddock cleared his throat. We've since recovered the original documents hidden in the choir loft, along with a torn portion of a letter that speaks of protecting her from the past. That letter was written by someone close to the Brent family. Someone with motive to hide the child's identity permanently. Gasps again rippled through the pews. Miss Marple fixed her gaze now on Major Withers. You served with Beatrice Brent's brother, did you not? He stared at her, unmoving. You were his closest friend. Perhaps more. You knew of Beatrice's disgrace and of the child born from it.
All right.
When that secret resurfaced, you tried to stop it from spreading. Still, the major said nothing. Did you kill Arnold Lacey? Craddock asked directly. Withers's face remained stone, but his fingers curled on the pew rail tightened. I did not mean to, he said at last, his voice hoarse. He wouldn't stop asking. He kept showing me that picture. Said he had proof, and I tried to scare him. Only meant to silence him. Take the photo, but he fought back, Craddock said. Withers nodded slowly. He fell, hit his head on the stones. Afterward, I panicked, hid the case, took the photo and copied it. And Beatrice? Miss Marple asked gently. She found out, or guessed. I confronted her, too. Told her to leave it alone. She refused. So He stopped himself. I didn't hurt her. I swear. I locked her away for her safety, I told myself. You knew about the root cellar, Miss Marple said. Of course you did. You played there as a boy. Craddock stepped forward. Major Jonathan Withers, I am placing you under arrest for the unlawful death of Arnold Lacey and the unlawful confinement of Miss Beatrice Pinder. There was no protest. The major stood, eyes hollow, and walked forward as if to the gallows. The congregation sat in stunned silence. But Miss Marple was not finished. She turned back to Reverend Pinder. There remains only one final matter. Why did you never come forward about the child, about your niece? The rector closed his eyes. Because I was ashamed, not of her, but of myself. I failed Beatrice Brent. I failed Isaac Beale, and I feared what it might mean for the church, for the parish. I thought I was protecting them, but I was only protecting my own cowardice. Miss Marple's voice softened. You may still make amends, Reverend. Truth is painful, but not nearly as painful as lies. He nodded, eyes glistening. Outside the church, the sun had begun to set, casting amber light over the rooftops and the elms. The bells had ceased, but something in the air had shifted like a wound beginning at last to close. Miss Marple stood on the path, her shawl tucked neatly around her shoulders. Inspector Craddock approached. You never cease to astonish me, he said, half smiling. She chuckled softly. Not. It wasn't astonishing at all, my dear inspector. It was merely a matter of watching people. Most crimes come down to secrets too long held. He nodded. And what of Beatrice? Miss Marple looked toward the distant cottages. She has choices now. The truth may be painful, but it gives her freedom, far more than the lies ever did. They stood quietly a moment longer. Craddock said, I suppose this means our case is all but closed. Miss Marple's lips quirked faintly. Almost. It was a gray morning after the church gathering. The kind where fog hangs low over the hedgerows, blurring outlines and dulling sounds. St. Hedwig's felt changed, quieter, hollowed out. The air carried the weight of revelation, but the village was far from settled. Though Major Withers had been taken into custody and Beatrice Pinder freed, the puzzle had not yet clicked fully into place. Miss Marple knew this, and so did Inspector Craddock. At the Laurels, Miss Marple's kettle was on again, the soft hissing promising another round of contemplation. She moved through her parlor with a kind of brisk calm, folding her knitting away and straightening her already straight books. Something still tugged at her thoughts, a loose thread she could feel but not yet see. "I suppose it's all over," said Miss Hartnell, who had taken it upon herself to bring scones as a gesture of village solidarity.
Oh.
She sat with a teacup balanced rather precariously on her knee. Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "Not quite." Miss Hartnell blinked. "But surely, if the Major confessed confession," said Miss Marple, "is not always the same as explanation. We have answers, yes, but not clarity." She rose and moved to a small oak writing desk tucked into the corner. From its drawer, she withdrew the original photograph, the one recovered from the choir loft in the church. Not the copy planted on Arnold Lacey's body. Miss Marple laid it on the table between them. A faded black and white image, slightly creased. At the corners, 3 figures, 1 woman, seated, cradling a baby, 2 men behind her. One smiling faintly, the other unreadable. Miss Hartnell peered. "That's Beatrice Brent, surely. And the child must be Beatrice Pinder. Who are the men?" Miss Marple tapped the image lightly. "We know the man on the left is Isaac Beale, her fiancé. He died shortly after the war, in a shipyard accident. But the man on the right, we assumed it was her brother. The rector, wasn't it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "That is not Reverend Thomas Pinder." Miss Hartnell's eyes widened. "Then who?" At that moment, Inspector Craddock arrived, his coat damp and his collar upturned. "Miss Marple," he said, brushing off rain as he entered. "I've been looking for you." "You were always bound to end up here," she said with a smile. "Do come in. Tea?" He accepted gratefully. "I've spoken with Beatrice. She's recovering well, remarkably well, in fact. Said she doesn't hate the Major, pities him." "She always did have a generous spirit," said Miss Marple. Craddock eyed the photograph now laid out on the table. "Still at it?" "Oh yes," she said. "I believe this picture is the final key." He took a closer look. "That's the same one Lacey had on him. The original," she confirmed. "The one he hid. The one that mattered." Craddock frowned. "It's not the clearest image. Not enough to prove identity." "Not unless one knows what to look for," Miss Marple said, leaning closer. "You see the man on the right. He's standing half-turned, but there's something distinctive there at the neck." Craddock squinted. "A pendant." "Not quite." "A watch fob, I believe. Ornate. Gold. In the shape of an acorn." Miss Hartnell let out a tiny gasp. "Good heavens! That sounds like Major Withers," Craddock finished quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "It was not Isaac Beale who fathered the child, nor was it a nameless soldier. The truth is rather more inconvenient for the living." Craddock exhaled. "You believe Withers was the child's father?" "I do," Miss Marple said. "And I think he knew." I think he supported Beatrice Brent discreetly financially, perhaps, but without ever acknowledging her or the child. When Beatrice Brent died, he ensured the child was sent away, possibly through the rector's help. He couldn't afford the scandal, nor the responsibility. Craddock sank into a chair, his brow furrowed. So when Arnold Lacey arrived, he saw the photograph, put the clues together, and confronted Withers. "Yes," said Miss Marple, and Withers feared exposure. More than that, he feared being seen for what he truly was, a man who had abandoned a child for the sake of propriety. Miss Hartnell whispered, "How terribly sad, sad." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Indeed." Craddock tapped the edge of the photograph. "But where does that leave Lacey's identity? You said he was searching for someone. Was it Beatrice Pinder or—" Miss Marple opened a small folder on the desk and handed Craddock a letter. The paper yellowed and the ink faded. It came with the photograph. Lacey's mother, his adoptive mother, wrote it shortly before she died. She explained she had taken in a child, born in the south of England, with no birth certificate, left on the steps of a hospital with a note, "Keep him from his father." Craddock blinked. Then Lacey himself. Miss Marple said gently, "I believe Arnold Lacey was Withers's son as well." The room fell silent. "So he wasn't searching for Beatrice," Miss Hartnell said finally. "He was searching for his mother. And in trying to find her, he met the man who had caused both her ruin and his abandonment. I imagine it was more than he could bear." Craddock stared at the letter. "Do you think Withers knew?" "I think he suspected," Miss Marple replied. "Perhaps in the moment before Lacey died, he even realized it. That would explain the violence. Some part of him must have recognized the truth and tried to bury it with the body." Craddock let out a long breath. So both of Withers's children came back to haunt him, one with questions, the other with the truth. "Fitting, in a way," Miss Marple said. "The past, you know, is never truly buried." Miss Hartnell dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "Poor Beatrice. She's been living with half a life all these years." Miss Marple looked out the window. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing the sharp edges of the garden gate. But now she has the whole of it. "And so, does the village?" Craddock rose, folding the letter carefully. "Take this for the file, okay? Won't change the charge, but it explains the motive." He paused at the door. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Again." She smiled faintly. "You always do the heavy lifting, Inspector." "I simply notice when people lie about the little things." After he left, Miss Hartnell sat back. "Do you think she'll stay, Beatrice?" "I rather think she might," said Miss Marple. "St. Hedwig's has a way of rooting people, especially when the soil is finally turned." She rose, took the photograph in her hand, and placed it in a small wooden box lined with blue velvet. Then, after a moment's thought, she locked the box and placed it back in her desk. Some truths, she said quietly, belong to the living now. The morning air was crisp, tinged with the subtle fragrance of damp earth and budding greenery. St. Hedwig's village had slipped back into its habitual rhythm. Co-bit, but beneath the calm surface, old tensions simmered quietly. The arrest of Major Withers and the rescue of Beatrice Pinder had not entirely settled the storm. There were lingering questions, and, for Miss Marple, threads yet to be pulled. She sat by the window in her parlor, the afternoon sun casting soft patterns across the lace curtains. Before her lay a small wooden box, its blue velvet lining cradling the delicate acorn-shaped pendant that had come to symbolize so much. It was an exquisite piece of goldwork, finely detailed with veins and the gentle curves of an acorn cup, suspended from a slender chain now faded with age. The pendant had first caught Miss Marple's eye in the photograph found hidden in the choir loft. More than an ornament, it had been a silent witness to long-buried secrets. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock. It was Inspector Craddock, freshly washed and in his usual slightly rumpled attire, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, placing the parcel on the table. "I thought you might like to see this." She smiled faintly, grateful for the company. Craddock carefully unwrapped the parcel to reveal a small, worn leather-bound ledger. The cover was cracked, but the gold lettering was still faintly visible. Beale Family Ledger. "This was found in Major Withers's cottage," Craddock explained, hidden behind a loose floorboard. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Family ledger, you say? This could tell us more about the relationship between Isaac Beale, Major Withers, and the woman who bore the child." She opened the ledger gently. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with neat handwriting, lists of names, financial accounts, and occasional notes in the margins. As she turned the pages, one entry caught her attention. It was dated 6 months before Beatrice Brent's death, paid to cover costs for Ely placement, £50. Miss Marple looked up at Craddock. The rector mentioned the child was sent to Ely. This payment might relate to that. Craddock nodded thoughtfully. It seems Major Withers was providing financial support discreetly. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And the ledger may show more." They pored over several more pages. There were entries recording regular sums paid out over a few years, sometimes described vaguely as household expenses or discretionary funds. "What strikes me," Miss Marple said softly, "is the care taken to obscure these payments. It speaks to shame, fear, or guilt, possibly all three." Craddock looked uneasy. "Not just the payments, is it? There's something else." Miss Marple pointed to a note in the margin, almost illegible. "Acorn pendant returned to sender." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Return to sender? Who was the sender? Apparently, Major Withers had sent the pendant as a gift, Miss Marple said, but it was returned. Rejected. Craddock frowned. Rejected by whom? That's the question, Miss Marple replied, and I think it's crucial. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the Laurels, where Beatrice Pinder had chosen to stay under the care of the village's kindly matron, Mrs. Giles. Beatrice was seated by the fire, looking pale but composed. Her eyes brightened when Miss Marple entered. "Come in, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about what you said about my mother and the past. I want to understand." Miss Marple settled into the armchair opposite her. "And that is very wise, Beatrice. Sometimes knowing the whole truth can free us from shadows." Beatrice nodded. "But there are parts I don't understand. Why would Major Withers send you a pendant and then have it returned? What does it mean?" Miss Marple reached into her pocket and produced the acorn pendant, placing it gently into Beatrice's hands. "The acorn is a symbol of potential growth from a small seed, strength hidden inside a shell. For Major Withers, it may have represented a hope or a promise he felt unable to fulfill." Beatrice turned the pendant over, her fingers tracing the delicate details. But who would refuse it? She wondered aloud. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. Sometimes the pain in accepting a token is greater than the pain in refusing. It may be that the pendant was sent to you or to someone you cared about, but was rejected because of pride, anger, or fear. Beatrice's expression darkened. "I never met my father. I thought Reverend Pinder was my uncle, and only recently did I learn more." Miss Marple nodded. Family ties can be complicated, especially when tangled with secrets and mistakes. Meanwhile, Craddock had not been idle. That evening, he returned with a letter he had found tucked inside a book in Major Withers's cottage. It was addressed to no one, written in a shaky hand. "If you find this, know that I am sorry. I was a coward, and I could not face the truth. I feared losing everything, my name, my honor, the respect I once had. But love is not measured by duty alone. It is measured by truth and by forgiveness." Miss Marple read the letter aloud, her voice steady but heavy with empathy. "This is a confession," she said softly, "not only of guilt but of regret. It confirms what we suspected, that Major Withers was deeply troubled by his past." Craddock looked up. "Do you think this will change how the village sees him?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but it may also bring healing. Once buried, has a way of growing like the acorn, slowly, patiently, until it becomes a mighty oak." The next morning, Miss Marple walked through the village. The air was cool, and the sun peeked through thinning clouds. She paused near the old mill and looked toward the root cellar where Beatrice had been hidden. A few villagers gathered nearby, whispers floating like leaves in the wind. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she heard a child laugh in the distance. Life, after all, continued. Her thoughts turned to Beatrice, now free from the past's burdens, yet still facing an uncertain future. Returning home, Miss Marple placed the ledger and the pendant carefully in her desk. She sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on human nature, the frailty, the resilience, and the courage it took to face one's history. For in every secret, every lie, there lay the possibility of truth, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The day dawned pale and cool over St. Hedwig's, with a faint breeze rustling the budding leaves along the village lanes. Miss Marple, seated at her small writing desk, looked thoughtfully out the window at the empty street. The village was still holding its breath, as if waiting for something or someone to break the fragile quiet that had settled since the revelations. Her gaze fell on the blue velvet box she had locked away weeks earlier, now resting beneath a neat stack of papers. The acorn pendant had revealed much, but she knew the truth still hid behind shadows. The doorbell chimed softly, and Miss Marple's visitor was revealed, Inspector Craddock, his expression grave but determined. "Good morning." "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her. "I've come with news, and I think it may be what we've been waiting for." She gestured to the chair near the hearth. "Please, sit. Do tell." Craddock settled down and pulled a folded envelope from his pocket. "We received a letter this morning. No signature, but the handwriting matches the notes Arnold Lacey left behind." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "A letter? From Arnold himself?" "Yes, or rather from someone claiming to speak for him. It was sent to the local post office and forwarded to us." She took the envelope, carefully unfolding the paper inside. The words were neat, deliberate, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "If you seek the truth about the man with the empty suitcase, look beyond what you see. The past is not merely buried by silence. It is concealed by deliberate forgetting. The answers you seek lie in the place where the past was most fiercely protected." Miss Marple tapped the paper lightly, cryptic, but telling. Craddock nodded. "I agree. And we've been re-examining the places connected to Isaac Beale and the Brent family. In particular, the old family estate, now abandoned." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "The Bramblewood estate. Yes, I thought so." Later that morning, Miss Marple and Craddock drove the winding road leading out of the village toward the estate's ruins. The manor house, long deserted, stood shrouded in ivy and shadow. Broken windows and sagging eaves hinted at decades of neglect, yet there was a peculiar dignity about the place. Craddock shone his torch into the darkened hallways as they explored. Dust motes floated in shafts of sunlight through holes in the roof. Paint peeled from walls that had once been proud. At the back of the manor, Miss Marple found the entrance to a small cellar, concealed behind a false panel. "This must be the place," she murmured, "where secrets were stored." They descended carefully into the cool, damp darkness. Shelves lined one wall, some still holding glass jars, others long emptied. Near the far corner, Miss Marple spotted a rusty metal box, wedged beneath a loose stone. She pulled it free with some effort. The box creaked as she lifted its lid. Inside lay a bundle of papers, tied with a faded ribbon and a small leather pouch. Miss Marple untied the ribbon and spread the papers on the cold stone floor. Were old letters and documents, many bearing the Beale family seal. One letter dated shortly after Beatrice Brent's death caught her eye. It was from Isaac Beale to Major Withers. "Jonathan, my friend, I fear the consequences of our silence grow heavier each day. The child is our shared burden. We do not act. The shadows will consume us all." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "This is evidence of a pact, an agreement to conceal the truth." Craddock nodded slowly. "So, they both knew, but chose secrecy over confession." The leather pouch intrigued Miss Marple. She opened it carefully to reveal a faded silk handkerchief embroidered with the initials BP. Beatrice. Pinder's, a token, perhaps, she mused. Left behind, or sent as a secret message. She glanced around the cellar. Something else caught her attention, a scrap of parchment, almost hidden beneath the stones. Craddock leaned down to retrieve it. Miss Marple unfolded the paper slowly. It was a note, partially torn, but the words were clear enough. "Forgive me, my daughter, for the lies you have inherited. Know that I loved you, even if I could not show it. B.B." Hush fell between them. Returning to the laurels, Miss Marple settled into her chair, the bundle of papers and the pouch resting on her lap. Beatrice had joined them, her face drawn but attentive. Miss Marple laid out the documents carefully. "These letters show that your mother and Major Withers entered into a secret agreement, but it was not without care or regret." Beatrice's hands trembled slightly. "I don't know what to say. Kay, never imagined." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Sometimes the truth is both lighter and heavier than we expect." She held up the handkerchief. "This was meant for you, perhaps a way of saying, even in silence, that love endures." Beatrice blinked back tears. "It means more than words can say." That evening, as the village lights flickered on and the shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on all she had learned. The empty suitcase, the photograph, the returned pendant, the hidden letters. They were pieces of a carefully guarded story of love, shame, and sacrifice. Yet one final question remained. Why had the killer gone to such lengths to mislead? And what did the empty suitcase truly symbolize? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The answer was close, closer than anyone suspected. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's parlor, casting soft, dappled patterns upon the worn oak floor. Outside, the gentle rustling of elm leaves whispered the passage of time, an ever-present reminder that even secrets buried deep beneath years and silence were subject to eventual reckoning. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting basket resting at her feet, though her hands remained still. Her gaze was fixed on the photograph that had sparked so much revelation, now carefully framed on the mantelpiece. She was contemplating the final elusive element of the mystery, the empty suitcase. It was an object at once ordinary and extraordinary. A container that had carried no luggage, no proof, no witness to the crime, yet had become the defining symbol of a story spun around absence and concealment. The kettle's gentle whistle stirred her from her thoughts. Miss Marple rose and poured herself a cup of tea, the warmth grounding her as she reviewed the facts in her mind. Her visitor arrived promptly, as if summoned by some invisible thread. Inspector Craddock, trenchcoat slightly dusted with the dampness of the late spring mist. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he greeted, settling in with a tired sigh. "I trust you've been well." "Quite well, thank you," she replied, though the case grows ever more intricate. Craddock took the cup of tea she offered. "Grateful, indeed. The village has been talking, and not all are at ease. There is a sense of unrest, of old wounds reopening." Miss Marple nodded. "Understandably. Truth often unsettles before it settles." She set down her cup and reached for a small notebook she kept on the side table, leafing through it carefully. "Tell me, Inspector, what have you uncovered about the suitcase itself?" Craddock frowned thoughtfully. "Oddly, it appears to have been bought second-hand, traced to a traveling salesman who passed through the village some weeks before Arnold Lacey's death." "Curious," Miss Marple mused. "Did this salesman know the owner?" "We don't know. But the suitcase was empty when found near the riverbank. No fingerprints except Lacey's, and it showed no signs of forced entry." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the faintest glimmer. "An empty suitcase is a peculiar thing to leave behind. It is a vessel for carrying burdens, memories, secrets, and sometimes deliberate misdirection." Craddock leaned forward. "I've been wondering about that. The suitcase was meant to draw attention, to distract from something more vital." Miss Marple smiled. "Precisely. What do we know about Arnold Lacey's belongings? His papers? Letters? Anything he might have hidden?" Craddock produced a small envelope from his breast pocket and handed it to her. Miss Marple carefully unfolded the contents, a bundle of letters and a folded piece of parchment with a faint watermark. "Letters from Beatrice Brent's family, perhaps?" she asked. "Mostly," Craddock said. But there are also some addressed to Lacey, and a few unsigned notes with cryptic messages.
Okay.
She scanned the notes, eyes narrowing slightly. One read, "Trust not the man with the empty suitcase. His baggage is invisible, but heavy." Another, "The past is a suitcase packed with lies. Only the truth can unseal it." Miss Marple tapped the table. "These are not just warnings, they are metaphors." Lacey was trying to tell us something. Craddock sighed. But what? "Perhaps the suitcase was never meant to contain physical evidence," Miss Marple suggested. "Instead, it symbolizes the hidden burden, the concealed history that Lacey carried." The inspector nodded slowly. "The empty suitcase as a metaphor for secrets kept from sight." Miss Marple stood and moved toward the window, gazing out at the village as twilight deepened. "The village itself," she said thoughtfully, "is like that suitcase. On the surface, quaint and peaceful. Beneath, layered with stories best left untold. It is only when those stories surface that disruption follows." Craddock glanced at her. "So the suitcase was a signal, a plea for understanding, or a final act of defiance?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Arnold Lacey sought to unpack the past, to reveal the truth his father and others tried to hide." She turned back to the room, her voice steady but gentle. "But the suitcase was empty because the truth cannot be carried physically. It must be carried within hearts and minds. It is invisible to the eye but weighs heavily upon those who bear it." Craddock frowned thoughtfully. "And the person who killed Lacey feared that truth would be revealed." "That is certain," Miss Marple replied. "Fear often drives people to desperate acts." She paused, considering. "There is one more element we must not overlook: the behavior of those closest to the victim in the final days." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Do you mean Beatrice and the rector?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Beatrice showed courage in facing her past. The rector, burdened by shame, has been strangely reticent." "But what of Major Withers's other connections?" Craddock looked uneasy. "You think someone else may be involved?" Miss Marple's smile was subtle, yet filled with quiet understanding. "Not directly, but someone who knew far more than they let show. Someone who quietly steered events from the shadows." Craddock leaned back, fingers intertwined. "Tie. Suppose that's what makes this case so tangled. Secrets, old allegiances, and silent fears all woven together." Miss Marple took a slow sip of her tea. "Exactly. And now we must be vigilant. The final clue might not lie in what is spoken, but in what remains unsaid." The evening grew deeper. Outside, a solitary church bell echoed faintly through the distance. Rising, Miss Marple approached the mantelpiece, where a framed photograph caught the fading light. She studied the figures closely: the woman clutching the child, the two men standing nearby. The past, she murmured, never truly disappears. It lingers in quiet moments, waiting for the right time to reveal itself. Craddock joined her side. Do you think the truth will bring peace to St. Hedwig's? Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with a soft warmth. Peace, I believe, comes not from forgetting, but from understanding. And that, Inspector, is what we must seek. The late spring days in St. Hedwig's slipped gently into one another. Yet beneath their calm exterior, tensions thickened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The village was no longer the tranquil refuge it once had been. Arnold Lacey's murder and the exposure of long-hidden secrets had stirred a restless unease. As ever, Miss Marple remained a quiet observer amid the village's growing anxieties. Her keen eyes caught subtle shifts, whispered conversations in the marketplace, furtive glances exchanged along narrow lanes, sudden silences whenever certain names surfaced. The fragile social fabric of St. Hedwig's was fraying, and with each day the strain became harder to ignore. That afternoon, as the sky darkened and the first cautious drops of rain began to fall, Miss Marple sat beside the fire in her parlor, a steaming cup of tea warming her hands. She was reviewing letters and documents once more, searching for the final threads to untangle the web. Her visitor arrived unexpectedly but was welcome. Reverend Pinder, the village rector. His face was pale and drawn, his usual calm shadowed by clear distress. "Miss Marple," he said softly, removing his hat and settling hesitantly into the chair opposite her. "I need to speak with you, if you have the time." "Of course, Reverend," she replied gently. "You are always welcome here." For a long moment, the rector looked away, gathering his thoughts. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began. "These recent events have shaken the village profoundly, as you know well. But beneath the surface lies more things I have carried for years." Miss Marple inclined her head, inviting him to continue. He took a deep breath. "When Beatrice was a child, I did everything in my power to protect her. The truth about her parentage was a burden that could have shattered her and the community's trust." She nodded thoughtfully. "It is a heavy burden, Reverend, but secrecy often breeds its own dangers." He glanced at her, regret flickering in his eyes. "Yes, and now that the truth has come to light, I fear what might follow." Miss Marple folded her hands. "What is it you fear?" "Repercussions," he answered quietly. "For Beatrice, for Major Withers's family, and for the village itself. Old wounds reopening could spark new conflicts." A sudden knock interrupted their talk. Miss Marple rose and opened the door to find Beatrice Pinder standing there, her face pale but determined. "May I come in?" she asked softly. "Of course," Miss Marple said, stepping aside. Beatrice entered, her eyes briefly meeting the rector's before turning to Miss Marple. "I wanted to thank you for helping me understand and for being here." Reverend Pinder stood, ready to leave, but Beatrice's voice stopped him. "Please stay. I think it's important we all speak openly." The rector hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple poured tea for all three, the warmth spreading through the room like a tentative bridge over troubled waters. As rain tapped against the window panes, the trio began to unravel more of the village's tangled history, the alliances and betrayals, loyalties tested, and sacrifices made in the name of honor. Beatrice's voice trembled as she spoke of the loneliness she'd endured, growing up cloaked in mystery and half-truths. "I was always searching," she said, "for a place to belong and for the father I never knew." Reverend Pinder's expression softened. "We all seek belonging in one way or another. But some truths are harder to bear," Miss Marple added gently, "and some lies way heavier than truth." Their conversation was broken by a sharp knock. Inspector Craddock entered, soaked from the rain, his face grim. "Miss Marple, Reverend Pinder." "Miss Pinder," he said, shedding his coat. "I've just received news Major Withers's solicitor has requested an urgent meeting.
Oh.
There are matters concerning his estate and legal ramifications of recent events." Beatrice's eyes widened. "What sort of matters?" Craddock looked serious. "It appears there may be financial complications linked to the family trusts, inheritances, debts, all of which could complicate the investigation." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "The past carries not only secrets, but obligations as well." The group exchanged uneasy looks. Outside, the storm had grown louder, thunder rolling distantly as if echoing the turmoil within the room. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone by the fire, turning the new information over in her mind. The solicitor's message hinted at a hidden motive, a reason someone might want to silence Arnold Lacey or stop the truth from coming out. Her fingers traced the edge of the blue velvet box holding the acorn pendant, a symbol both of hope and concealment. She thought of Major Withers, whose pride and fear had set these tragic events in motion. Of Beatrice, whose strength shone despite years of hardship. And Arnold Lacey, whose quest for truth had cost him dearly. The village teetered on the brink of change. The storm, both real and metaphorical, gathered strength. Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of resolve. One last step remained, one final secret to uncover before the story could reach its end. And as the rain lashed against the windows, the old detective knew the calm before the storm was about to break. The rain had finally stopped, leaving St. Hedwig's wrapped in damp stillness. A fine mist hovered over the village rooftops the next morning, and puddles reflected the gray sky like quiet pools of memory. Miss Marple rose early, her mind unusually sharp even for her meticulous nature. today she had work to complete. She had spent much of the night with her thoughts not only turning over Arnold Lacey's murder, but weighing the complex human motives behind it. Motives, she often said, spoke far louder than opportunity. And here, they stretched across years of resentment, fear, protection and, above all, shame. After breakfast, she donned her trusty tweed coat and headed into the village. Her first stop was the solicitor's office in the square. Mr. George Tillery, a precise little man who clearly disliked disorder. He greeted her with a twitch of his mustache. "Ah, Miss Marple. I was expecting you." "Indeed. I understand there are details concerning the late Major Withers's estate," she said, settling carefully into the hard wooden chair. Tillery nodded, rifling through a folder. "Yes. Actually, there is a trust established some 20 years ago. It names a secondary beneficiary should the major or his son die. Person was Arnold Lacey." Miss Marple blinked. "Arnold. Yes, an unusual clause, unless one considers certain rumors long whispered about." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag's handle. "What sort of sum are we discussing, Mr. Tillery?" "A substantial one. Adjusted to today's value, several £1,000, plus the Withers house in full." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured softly, like a gentle rain. "That certainly casts Arnold's visit in a new light." "More than a visit, I'd say," Tillery replied. "He likely came to claim what he believed was rightfully his." Miss Marple's thoughts spun. If Arnold had discovered the trust stand, the truth of his parentage, then his actions and his murder held deeper meaning. This was no mere secret from the past. It was about inheritance, legitimacy, and power. She thanked Mr. Tillery and left, her mind piecing together a new framework. Yet one last conversation remained, one she had delayed until the very end. She arrived at the rectory just before noon. The garden was sodden, hedges heavy with lingering drops. Beatrice Pinder opened the door, her face calm but guarded. "Miss Marple," she said, "I suspected you might come." They sat in the small parlor, letting silence stretch between them. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. "Beatrice, I must ask something difficult. I know you have told the truth about your father. But tell me, was there more between you and Arnold Lacey than you have let others believe?" Beatrice looked down, hands twisting in her lap. Slowly, she nodded. "He was angry," she said, "and lost. He came to me not long before he died. He said he had proof, something about a solicitor's letter, and a plan to confront Major Withers. He said it was time the past was owned up to." Miss Marple listened carefully. "And did he show you the letter?" He said it wasn't safe, that he'd hidden it." "Did he mention who he had spoken to about it?" Beatrice hesitated. "Only that he'd had words with Walter Gresham, that Gresham had warned him to keep quiet, for the family's sake. Miss Marple's lips thinned. Walter Gresham had been Major Withers's longtime friend and confidant. A man known for his discretion, yes, but also for his ruthlessness in preserving the family's reputation. She rose. "Thank you, my dear. I believe you've helped me greatly." Miss Marple's next visit was to Gresham House. Walter Gresham received her in the drawing room.
Okay.
A faint twitch of surprise passing over his otherwise impassive face. "I thought I might see you," he said dryly. "The village has never quite recovered from the way you step into trouble." "Trouble usually exists before I arrive," Miss Marple replied. "I merely help sweep it into the light." He offered a tight smile, gesturing for her to sit. "I'll be direct, Mr. Gresham," she began. "Did you know about the provision in the Major's trust naming Arnold Lacey as beneficiary?" Gresham didn't blink. "Yes, I was his trustee." "I see." "Ooh. Then you also knew that Arnold had recently come to claim his inheritance, or at least to assert his claim." A long pause. "He had no right to it. Perhaps not legally, but morally." "That's a more dangerous argument, Miss Marple." "Dangerous to families, to reputations, to peace." Miss Marple studied him. "And so you warned him off." "I did," said Gresham evenly. "I told him to leave it alone, that it would destroy more than it would solve." And yet he persisted. Gresham's jaw tensed. He left the house angry. "I assumed he would go, but clearly someone didn't trust he would remain silent." Miss Marple let the words settle. "Did you kill him?" He looked up, startled, then laughed bitterly. "No, I protect things, Miss Marple. I don't destroy them." "But you would protect them at all costs." He said nothing. When she departed, the weight of his silence followed her. That evening, Miss Marple stood before the hearth, a single candle casting flickering shadows across her features. She held a scrap of parchment, the remains of a torn letter found by Arnold's landlady and delivered to the inspector. Faded ink, but legible, cannot remain silent forever. If I do not speak, others will. The truth will come, and the name Pinder will be spoken in court. It was enough to explain the motive. Enough to confirm what Miss Marple now knew. The truth, long buried, was rising. And though Miss Marple had not yet named the killer, she now understood the final pieces. Tomorrow, she would call them all together. The end.